Number 5. Finding good colors. I think our misery as artists start here. How do we even find good colors? How do master artists know what shade to use when they're drawing? Is it because they studied and practiced color theory? No. I mean, yes, but practical ways to find good colors do exist. Let's start from the beginning. So after I'm done with my line art, I start blocking in the colors. For the base colors, I go with middle tones. But the thing is that using raw mid-tones feels really bland, so I change them up with a couple adjustments. Above all the layers, I make a new layer and set the blending mode to screen. I use bright yellows and some magenta to spice up my base colors. I also lower the opacity to 20% so it's not too overpowering. Then I make another new layer and put it on top of everything. This time, I wanted to put emphasis on the sunlight shining from behind her. So I grab some more bright yellow and paint the parts where sunlight would hit. Here is how it looks without adjustments, and here is how it looks now. With just a couple of adjustments, the shading ends up looking much more distinct and the piece already looks more interesting. Number 4. Dramatic lighting. Okay, so what even is dramatic lighting? Dramatic lighting is, well, a dramatic way of expressing light and shadow. Basically, the shadows and the light clash sharply and this creates a nice cinematic look, adding emotion and, dare I say, aura. I tend to use my own method of doing things, but there's lots of ways to implement this in your art. Basically, before diving into all that tedious rendering, I make a multiply layer, cover the whole character with a grayish color, then erase the parts where I think the light would hit. Look, that already made a difference. By the way, I changed the blending mode to linear burn because the colors looked more fleshed out that way. Making a main shadow like this helps me understand where I should focus my shadows and highlights. I also color some parts differently. For example, I lock the shadow layer and then use light colors on the skin part and more red colors on the hair part. And we have a nice looking shading on our character. So this step was kinda essential at this point in my drawing, and I'll explain to you why. When I was at this point in the whole process, I realized this doesn't feel captivating to the viewer. Like, I want the viewer to be sucked into this drawing and click on it to see every detail. But even though I've been working on this for a long time, everything still looked generic and I almost gave up on this drawing. But I didn't, and for once did my best to trust the process. So I decided to add more steps to my coloring. I used a lot of rich colors here, so I decided to desaturate them to make everything a little less rainbow barfy. I created a new layer, put the layer on top of everything. With the lasso tool, I selected the parts inside the shadows, mostly closer to the edges. Then I added bright gray and blue colors with the airbrush. By adding gray tones, I pushed the bright colors to the front. Instead of bombarding the drawing with fresh bright colors, adding some desaturated parts will guide your viewer's eye, telling them what they should focus on. So number 3 is basically adding desaturated gray colors to emphasize bright colors. Thanks to this, I could finally start to see this going as good as I initially imagined. Number 2. Color filters are your friend? I'm gonna be honest, I've never sat down and specifically studied color theory that much. I just watched a couple videos and didn't really do much else. It's kind of weird to say this in a coloring guide video, but I developed my own experimental methods of finding good colors even though I'm not well versed in color theory. One of the filters I like to use is curves. Curves basically help you with controlling your highlights and shadows. I don't think there's any secrets to this. I just play with it at the start, in the middle, and after my drawing is done to manage the colors. The second one is color balance. Color balance is super useful for shifting the hue of the shadows, midtones, and highlights. I tend to try it out along the way when I'm like, wait, what if the shadows were blue, and see how it works. There's also a lesser known filter that I like to use a lot. It's called color lookup. You can only use it in Photoshop, so you might have to sell your soul to Adobe or just sail the seas like a pirate. So what this does is basically you window shop for your favorite filtered look. For me, it sometimes looks too much, so I play with the opacity or just delete some parts. It's a huge help since I'm not good with colors and it helps me find some good color combinations. Make sure to play with your adjustment layers opacity to see if it looks better on the lower side. If some parts of the colors look good but other parts look bad, just click on the layer mask and erase the parts you don't like. The color filters saved me a bunch of times throughout my art career. They helped me make my art look more interesting and professional looking, so make sure to use them. So number 1 is a huge game changer in my opinion. You should be aware of this one thing when starting and finishing your art. If nothing in this entire video works for you, mastering the black and white values should be your end all be all. So how do we make sure the values are good enough? To check my values, I create a layer that shows me the grayscale version of the artwork. This way I can make sure the values are correct, and if anything looks iffy, I correct it. As for how exactly I do it, create a new hue saturation adjustment layer and set the saturation -100. Put the layer on top of all the other layers, change the blending mode from normal to color, and tada! We have a grayscale image. All I do is make sure that it's not looking too confusing. Basically have a bunch of big dynamic shapes that help the viewer understand what's going on. So I check the values from time to time to see if the shadows are shadowing and the lights are lighting properly. I use all of these methods to upgrade my colors. These tips and tricks are things I've seen from other artists or things I experimented with and developed by myself. Some of them might not work out with your art style, but feel free to practice and develop your own. What are your coloring hacks? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching.